What would your younger self say about how your family turned out?
I was told the family dinner wasn't for me. The words were delivered with that sharp, polite edge that cuts deeper than shouting ever could. "This is just for the successful ones, Rachel. You wouldn't feel comfortable," my mother had said over the phone, as if she were protecting me from some awful embarrassment rather than actively creating one. I stood there, phone in hand, staring at the reflection of my own tired face in the microwave door while the rest of them planned a fancy evening around a long oak table that I had grown up eating at. My brother Mark with his endless stories about property deals, my sister Claire with her sharp suits and sharper opinions, my parents glowing as if they had raised a dynasty of prodigies. And me excluded, because apparently I didn't make the cut. It was humiliating, but the sort of humiliation that comes wrapped in family dynamics so old and knotted you barely know where it begins. I ordered takeout from the cheap Chinese place down the street, the one where the soy sauce packets always explode in the bag, and sat in my apartment eating sesame chicken straight from a paper box. The sound of neighbors laughing through thin walls became my background music. I was supposed to be part of my family, yet I felt more like a tenant who had accidentally wandered into someone else's life. The irony wasn't lost on me. They didn't think I belonged at the table, but while I shoveled rice into my mouth, a deal with my name on it was already circling through boardrooms across the country. I hadn't told them about it, not one word. For years I had been labeled the family dreamer, the one who always had big ideas and small follow-through. Mark once joked that I couldn't even hold a job long enough to get a proper tax return. Claire, in one of her more generous moods, suggested I look into something stable, maybe teaching, because chasing all those creative whims doesn't exactly pay the bills. My parents, caught between love and disappointment, nodded along. Every Thanksgiving it was the same performance, polite questions about what I was working on now, followed by smug silence when my answers didn't sparkle with the same luster as my siblings' stories. That night, while they lifted champagne glasses and congratulated one another, I sat cross-legged on the couch in sweatpants that had lost their elastic years ago. I wasn't glamorous. I wasn't performing success. I was just hungry and tired, the glow of my laptop illuminating a cluttered coffee table. My chopsticks snapped halfway through the meal, and I laughed out loud at the sheer absurdity of it. Alone, eating lo mein with half a chopstick, that was apparently all my family thought I was worth. But here's what they didn't know. The same woman they had brushed aside like an embarrassing cousin was also the founder of a company that had just closed a $120 million acquisition deal. The ink was still drying. The press releases hadn't dropped yet. My name wasn't on television screens, not yet. But it was coming, faster than even I had realized. While I poured cheap wine into a chipped mug and watched reruns on Netflix, people in suits 3 time zones away were rehearsing how they would announce it. I didn't plan to keep it secret forever. I had promised myself I would tell my parents when the time felt right. But right had never come. The dinners where I could have shared my milestones always became competitions, and I was tired of being the underdog who got cut off mid-sentence so someone else could brag about their latest accomplishment. So I stayed silent, working through the nights, eating instant noodles, and collecting scars that no one else bothered to notice. The irony was that my family thought they were shielding me from shame when they excluded me from that dinner, but in truth, they were unknowingly protecting themselves from the moment they would have to face exactly how wrong they had been. The phone buzzed while I scraped the last grains of rice out of the box. Group chat notifications lit up the screen, blurry pictures of my parents at the restaurant, Mark raising his glass, Claire in her sleek black dress. Family pride, my dad captioned one photo. I almost typed something back, some half-bitter, half-funny comment, but deleted it. Let them bask in their moment. They had no idea the storm was coming. As I washed out the mug and turned off the kitchen light, I felt the first flicker of a smile. It wasn't joy, not yet, but anticipation. The kind of anticipation you get when you know a punchline is about to land, and no one else at the table sees it coming. While they toasted each other for being the successful ones, I was about to be broadcast nationwide as the woman who had just pulled off one of the biggest deals of the year. I didn't know the exact hour it would break. I only knew it was inevitable. The press had the story, the statements were being finalized, and my picture was already cued for television anchors to reference. I turned off my phone, crawled into bed, and pulled the blanket over my head. Tomorrow, the narrative would shift. By this time next week, the same people who had denied me a seat at their table would be tripping over themselves to sit at mine. And yet, as I lay there drifting into sleep, I couldn't shake one thought. Would I even let them? The family dinner had been pitched for weeks as a celebration of grit and achievement, a curated pageant of success where the stories were polished to a mirror sheen and the facts were rearranged into flattering angles, and although I told myself I didn't care, the minute I imagined the long oak table, the frosted tumblers sweating under chandelier light, and my mother's careful laugh floating across the silverware, my chest tightened the way it always had when I was a kid waiting on the steps to be told whether I was going or staying home. Mark would be there early in his pale jacket that somehow made him look both casual and expensive, holding court about market timing as if he personally parted the seas of interest rates, while Claire would arrive a little late on purpose, sliding into her chair like a closing argument and letting the room organize itself around her confidence, and my parents, God bless them for at least trying to disguise it, would beam at that table as though they were unveiling a gallery of their finest work, with the unspoken reminder that the frame where I might have hung was still empty. I told myself to let it pass, to stay in my lane and keep moving, yet as evening settled over the city and the restaurant posted its tonight's chef specials to social media with a photo of the exact private room my family had booked, a stubborn heat rose in my throat. Not jealousy exactly, more a feeling of being misfiled, like someone had stuck me in the drawer labeled miscellaneous when I belonged under a different letter entirely, and to keep from spiraling I opened my laptop and worked through a checklist the way airplane pilots do before takeoff, not because I doubted my destination, but because ritual studies the hands. The due diligence archive was complete, the escrow confirmation had pinged my inbox that afternoon, the joint statement with the acquiring company lived in a shared folder with a time-stamped embargo that felt like a loaded spring, and the media list my communications manager had built read like a roll call of people who had never returned my emails 3 years ago but somehow now wanted my perspective on leadership, risk, and vision, which made me laugh in a way that tasted like pennies. Between emails, I let my mind drift back to a series of small scenes that stitched the family mythology in place, Mark offering to front me a little cash at Thanksgiving in exchange for a percentage of whatever you may or may not be building, smiling like a landlord with a key, Claire suggesting I sit in on a weekend seminar about personal branding, because if you're not a brand, you're just noise, my mother pulling me aside after a Christmas brunch to say she worried I mistook stubbornness for courage, and that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself is to lower the bar you keep missing, which would have stung less if I hadn't seen the relief on her face for having finally said it. All of it landed on me now like a stack of junk mail, each envelope addressed incorrectly, the pile heavy only because it had gone unacknowledged for so long. I opened the family group chat, not to start a fight, but to measure the temperature, and there they were, arranged as predictably as place settings, with Mark's photo of champagne flutes pretending to clink in motion, Claire's caption about closing chapters and opening others, and my father's proudly misspelled toast to resilience, which would have been endearing if it hadn't been lined with the implication that resilience only counts when it can be measured in bonuses and square footage. I typed looks beautiful, then deleted it, typed hope the successful ones enjoy, then deleted that too, and sat staring at the blinking cursor like it might choose a side for me. The cursor chose silence, which was probably a mercy, because a different impulse rose in its place, not a tantrum or a speech, but something precise and cool, like sliding a rook across a chessboard to a square no one else had considered. I called the restaurant and asked to speak with the floor manager, and when he picked up with a voice that sounded both efficient and stressed, I explained that I would like to place payment for a private party in one of their rooms, that I had the reservation name and time, that I wanted to cover the full bill in advance, gratuity included, and that along with the final course I wanted a single envelope delivered to the table containing the receipt and a short note. The manager asked if I was sure, because it was not a small number, and I told him I was very sure, and when he asked for the message I told him to write, with his neatest pen, covered by the unsuccessful one, who hopes dessert tastes a little different when humility is on the plate. He laughed, not mockingly, but with a weary appreciation of someone who has seen families perform all manner of theater beneath high ceilings, then processed my payment while I breathed in and out as if I had just surfaced from a deep pool, and realized the shore was closer than it looked. It was not revenge in the cinematic sense. There were no violins playing and no speeches, but it was a recalibration. A gentle twist of the dial that would turn down the music just long enough for everyone at that table to wonder who gets to define success and why they had been so confident about the answer. I did not want them hungry. I did not want them embarrassed in front of strangers. I wanted a hiccup in the script, a pause between clinks and compliments where the room shifted half a degree and they felt the draft from a door they hadn't noticed opening. When the manager promised the envelope would arrive with the dessert course, I thanked him and set my phone face down, the apartment quiet around me except for the hum of the refrigerator and the street's faint hiss, and I realized my hands had stopped shaking. I wish I could say I felt satisfied right then, that paying their bill and slipping in a line about humility folded the whole story into a neat napkin, yet the truth is that my body vibrated with something closer to dread than triumph. Because I knew a larger wave was building offshore, a public one that would not merely sting, but rearrange the coastline, and if the dinner gesture was a private correction, the next thing would be an earthquake with cameras. As if to confirm it, my phone lit up. Again, only this time it wasn't the family chat or a restaurant confirmation. It was a producer whose name I recognized from a national morning show asking, politely and urgently, whether I might be available for a brief comment about a rumored acquisition linked to my company, and whether they could go on record with my title by midnight. When the producer's message lit my screen with that mix of urgency and restraint that only people who live on deadlines can pull off, I realized the window between my family's dessert course and the embargoed press release had narrowed to the width of a credit card, and that the next move had to be executed with the kind of precision I had spent the better part of 3 years practicing at 2 a.m. when servers coughed and term sheets threatened to evaporate. I wrote back that I would not go on camera tonight, that I respected the embargo, and that if they wanted a single on-the-record sentence, they could have it at 1 minute past midnight with the stipulation they printed intact and uncut. Then I typed the line I had been carrying in my pocket like a talisman since the afternoon my mother suggested I lower the bar for my own sake. This deal belongs to the engineers and the drivers and the clerks who kept showing up when people told us to be realistic, and to every person who has been told that the bar is too high. It is not. It is exactly where you left it. I pressed send, then sat back and let the quiet of the apartment press a hand to my sternum while the reel unspooled in my mind. Not a highlight reel of triumphs, but a cluttered, expensive film of mistakes and stubbornness and the specific kind of hunger that attaches itself to you when you are the only person at the table who believes the math will eventually reconcile with the dream. I saw the original whiteboard in the co-working space, where we understood in a flash of exhausted clarity that small manufacturers were bleeding cash while waiting on invoices, and that the underwriting models built for giants ignored the rhythms of people who run a shop floor with a calendar and a gut. I saw Jasmine sleeping under her hoodie after rewriting the scoring engine from scratch when a vendor's data feed corrupted half our test set. I saw Theo pulling a double shift to sit with an owner in Ohio who thought our product was a magician's trick until we showed him that the trick was just dignity returned at a fair rate, and I saw my own bank account teeter over a canyon the month we decided not to take a predatory bridge round from a fund that wanted my board seat as collateral for their condescension. In that same stretch of memory lived the little humiliations that never make the case study, but form the shape of a person more surely than applause ever could. Like the time I asked Mark to introduce me to a contact at a logistics company, and he said he'd be happy to if I could show traction that looks like traction and not hope, or when Claire suggested a short course on executive presence because if people are going to take you seriously, you have to look like someone who can afford to be taken seriously, which I took to mean that the thrift store blazer I loved was a disqualifying offense. I put those moments into a drawer labeled fuel and kept working, because the only way to make the mirror stop lying is to change what it reflects. And changing it required a degree of focus that does not leave room for choking down disappointment every time the group chat chirped about somebody's new kitchen renovation. The acquisition itself, for all its drama on paper, had come together like most real things do, slowly and then all at once, and while the public would see a headline that made it sound like a lightning strike, I knew it was the patient accumulation of 1,000 almosts, 1,000 no-for-nows that softened into yes-ifs. And finally a clean yes when the acquiring CEO looked across a glass table and said he was tired of watching small businesses get punished for not being big that he wanted. The halo of fixing a problem his competitors were too insulated to notice, and that he would leave my team intact because he understood the only irreplaceable thing in a company is the rhythm of the people who build it. I signed the purchase agreement, watched escrow confirm, and told myself I would breathe when the statements were filed, the integration scheduled, and the call with our earliest customers completed. Yet here I was, hours later, body humming like a transformer and breath stuck halfway between a laugh and a groan. I opened my calendar and created an invite for the following Friday, a small act that felt like rearranging the furniture in my own head, titling it Dinner, Updated House Rules, and setting the location to my apartment. Then in the description I wrote one sentence that landed somewhere between gentle and surgical. Seats are available for those who bring respect, not resumes, and I added my parents, my siblings, and myself. No plus ones, no menu, no explanation. Just the quiet assertion that the table still existed and that admission was no longer tied to a scoreboard, which was, in its way, a form of revenge I could live with because it balanced the ledger without sending anyone to collections. To round out the symmetry, and perhaps to exorcise the last ghost of that phone call where I was told the family dinner was only for the successful ones, I did one more small thing that made me grin despite myself. I registered a domain for a foundation that would launch in tandem with the announcement, a scholarship in my grandmother's name for women who had been told to aim lower, and on the barebones landing page I placed the line only for the successful ones, in quotation marks with a footnote that read, if you are still trying, you are already in, then cued the page to go live at the same minute as the embargo lifted, so that when anyone searched my name they would find not just the valuation, but the valve I intended to open. It was a statement aimed at precisely 4 people and the thousands who would never know the backstory, but would understand the sentiment instantly. My phone buzzed again, this time with a text from the restaurant manager, envelope delivered. Room went quiet. One gentleman laughed, then no one did, followed by a photo of the bill tucked next to a ramekin of berries like a shy guest. And I pictured my mother's fingers smoothing the paper while she did the math of what it meant to have your narrative interrupted by facts you did not authorize, and I felt a pang that was not remorse exactly, but a wish that we had learned to speak a different language sooner. Before that pang could turn into anything heavier, a second vibration arrived, an email from the acquiring company's communications director with the subject line timing change, informing me that a leak on an industry blog had forced their hand, that the release would move up by 30 minutes to preempt the rumor cycle, that a coordinated push across networks would start in 22, and that my statement would go live alongside a headshot they had pulled from our Series A announcement unless I could send an updated photo in the next 5. I stood, lightheaded and oddly calm, as if a storm had chosen a precise path through familiar streets, and while I was debating whether to send the photo of me at my kitchen table in the sweatshirt I had worn all day or the more polished shot from last winter, my screen filled with a call from my mother, then a second from Claire layered on top of it like competing headlines, and just under those a new message from Mark that read, "Is this real and did you know? Because if you did and you let me raise a toast tonight without telling me, that's cold, even for you," which I read twice before letting the calls ring out, opening the email window, and hovering my cursor over the attachment icon as the clock ticked toward a minute I had waited on for years and a city away, under chandelier light, for people finally ran out of script. The first ripple hit before midnight, Not with the blare of a headline on television, but with the subtler tremor of texts arriving from people I had not spoken to in years, as though they had all conspired to remember my number at the exact same moment. A girl from high school who once borrowed my notes and never returned them wrote, "Just saw your face on CNBC, is this real?" An old manager who had dismissed me as too emotional for leadership sent a curt but efficient email asking if I might explore synergies between my new resources and his consulting firm. Even my ex-boyfriend, the one who told me to get serious and stop wasting my time on pipe dreams, reached out with a string of ellipses followed by, "Wow, proud of you." The irony wasn't lost on me. For years, silence was the only sound I heard after explaining my work, and now noise came in from every angle, as though the entire world had decided to return its missed calls at once. When the embargo finally lifted and the acquisition was officially public, the headlines appeared like a storm front-rolling across multiple networks and feeds at the same time, each one using the same photograph of me in a blazer that barely fit, smiling as if I had been caught in the middle of an inside joke. The words "nine-figure deal" and "disruptive model" looked almost absurd next to that image of me, because I knew the woman in that photo still worried about affording rent at the time it was taken. I sat on the couch in the same sweatshirt I had worn all week, watching my name scroll across a ticker at the bottom of a news broadcast while a serious man in glasses explained the impact on small to mid manufacturers, as if he had been following my journey from the start. He hadn't. None of them had. That was the part that made me laugh out loud, a laugh edged with bitterness, because the narrative had already shifted into the kind of mythology that erases the actual mess and replaces it with a neat storyline for public consumption. The family group chat, which had gone silent after the envelope stunt at dinner, flickered back to life around 2 in the morning. First, my father typed, "We are proud, Rachel, really proud." Then Mark chimed in with a tone that strained toward casual, but carried the weight of panic. "Congratulations, I had no idea you were this far along. We should talk about strategy, maybe collaborate." Claire's message landed last, as sharp and polished as always, impressive. "I hope you've prepared for the political side of this, because people will come after you. Call me if you want guidance." I stared at those messages, not answering, because answering would have given them a foothold into the moment, and I wasn't ready to surrender the silence that was now, finally, mine to control. As dawn crept in, the reality of what had happened began to crystallize in ways more practical than glamorous. My phone battery drained under the weight of constant notifications, emails stacked into unread piles of congratulations and requests, and LinkedIn practically convulsed under the pressure of strangers declaring they had always believed in me. The absurdity of that phrase made me snort into my coffee, because if belief were real, it would have shown itself when I was begging people to trust me with 10 minutes of their time instead of now, when they were tripping over themselves to attach their names to my story. That morning, when the first sunlight cut across the kitchen table, I ignored my mother's fourth call and instead opened my inbox to draft a message to my earliest team. They were the only people I owed my words to, and I wanted them to hear gratitude before the noise of everyone else drowned it out. The strangest part was how ordinary my apartment looked in contrast to the extraordinary storm outside its walls. A coffee mug with a chip on the rim, sneakers kicked under the couch, dishes drying on a rack, none of it matched the glossy narrative unfolding on television. I realized then that success doesn't transform you into someone else, it just magnifies the choices you've been making in obscurity all along. The world had only now chosen to pay attention, but I was still the woman eating leftover sesame chicken in a sweatshirt, wondering if her family would ever see her as anything more than the disappointing sibling. And yet, for the first time, I was the one who held the upper hand, because the power no longer sat at their table, it sat in my quiet refusal to answer the phone. The calls did not stop. By the time I finally silenced the device altogether, the voicemail icon glowed with a number I could barely believe. My parents, my siblings, even distant cousins who hadn't spoken to me in decades were trying to reattach themselves to a story they had written me out of. I let them pile up, message after message, until they became background noise, and I sat with my coffee in hand, staring at the rising sun and knowing that the real question wasn't whether they wanted me back, but whether I wanted them. The day after the deal broke, the world around me moved with the velocity of a hurricane, yet inside my own head there was a steady, unnerving calm, the kind of calm you feel when you have been sprinting for so long that stopping feels like falling. Reporters called nonstop, former colleagues lined up to remind me of the one time they believed in me, investors who had once scoffed at my pitch suddenly wanted to meet for coffee, and even the neighbors who had never learned my name started waving at me in the lobby as though I had been a secret celebrity all along. Yet none of it meant as much as the unanswered calls from my family that continued to mount like an unpaid bill, each voicemail loaded with a different flavor of apology, from my mother's tender regret to Mark's frantic justification, to Claire's oddly formal insistence that she could guide me through what came next. I listened to none of them in full, letting the robotic previews roll out of the speaker before deleting each one, because I wanted to control the moment when their voices entered my space again, and for the first time, I had that control entirely. When the invitation I had scheduled for a private dinner finally landed in their inboxes later that week, I imagine it struck them as both a surprise and a challenge, because I kept it stripped down to the bone. No fancy restaurant, no suggested attire, no promises of champagne or speeches, just my apartment, my table, and the sentence I had written almost with a smirk: seats are available for those who bring respect, not resumes. For years I had watched them curate who belonged at the table as though life were a gated club, and now the gates had swung in my direction. Whether they would show up was not certain, but I suspected pride would not let them decline, because pride had always been the secret fuel beneath their laughter and their dismissive words, the thing that made them believe they had the right to measure me. The evening they arrived, my apartment looked nothing like the oak-paneled room of our family dinners, yet I had laid the table with deliberate care, placing simple plates, a modest bottle of wine, and food I had cooked myself. Not to impress, but to remind us all that nourishment does not need chandeliers. When the doorbell rang, I felt a flicker of nerves, but it was not the old desperation to be accepted, rather the thrill of knowing that they were walking into a space where I defined the rules. They entered with the awkward smiles of people who have rehearsed apologies but are not sure when to deliver them, and for a long moment we simply stood in the threshold, the silence more eloquent than any greeting. We sat down, and for the first time in years, there were no raised voices competing for dominance, no elaborate stories about contracts or promotions meant to overshadow. My parents looked older than I remembered, as if disappointment had aged them more than time, while Mark and Claire shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and used to being on ground that was not theirs to claim. We ate. We spoke in half-measured tones about weather and traffic, circling the real conversation like wary animals around a fire. Finally, after a glass of wine had softened the edges, my mother began with the line I knew she had practiced: "We may not have understood your choices, but we are proud of what you've built." I let the words hang there without rushing to fill the silence, because for once silence was my ally. When I finally spoke, I did not raise my voice or deliver a monologue of grievances. I simply leaned back, folded my hands, and said, "I almost didn't come tonight." After all, I wasn't sure if this dinner was meant for the successful ones, or the ones still trying. The sentence landed like a stone dropped into water, the ripples spreading across their faces in real time. A flicker of shame from my mother, a defensive twitch from Mark, a stiff narrowing of eyes from Claire, and in that moment, I felt a release I hadn't realized I had been waiting for. Revenge, I discovered, did not always require fireworks or vindictive speeches. Sometimes it was as simple as forcing people to sit with the echo of their own words until they understood what they had cost. The rest of the evening passed in cautious conversation, but the balance had shifted permanently. The hierarchy that had once positioned me as the family's weak link dissolved into something unspoken but undeniable. When they finally left, murmuring promises to stay closer and be more supportive, I walked them to the door without committing myself to any answer. Because here is the truth I carried back to my empty apartment once the door shut behind them: success had not erased the betrayal, it had not rewritten the years of being dismissed or excluded. It had only given me the power to decide who belonged in my life from this point forward. As I cleared the plates and poured the last glass of wine for myself, I thought about the question that had haunted me ever since the news broke. Would I let them back in? I still did not have the answer, and maybe that was the point. Some doors stay half open not because you want the people on the other side to walk through, but because you want them to stand there wondering if they ever will. I sipped slowly, looked out at the city shimmering under the weight of stories being told about me that were both true and not true, and whispered to myself that the hardest part of success was not achieving it, but deciding what to do with those who had once believed you never could. And as the night deepened, I knew that decision would not come quickly, because sometimes the most satisfying revenge is not a final act, but the ongoing silence of an unfinished answer.